Hi, I'm Steven Rivellino. I'm a Broadway and West End theatrical producer, and I'm honored to also be a Viking guest speaker. It's already springtime, it's May, and I always take this time of the year to think about where I'd like to travel to in the summer. And inevitably, it ends up to be the magical landscape of Norway. So today I thought we'd discuss two giants of Norwegian cultural artistry, if you will, Henrik Ibsen and, of course, Edvard Grieg. And together, they give us what I call the words and music of Norway. So let's begin. To all Norwegians, Henrik Ibsen is indeed a national hero. He is definitively Norway's playwright, and no doubt one of the finest playwrights in the world. He grew up in the small Norwegian coastal town of Skien, very near Christiania, which was the original name of Oslo, the capital, and he was the oldest of 5 children. His father, Knud, was a successful merchant, and his mother, Marishan, painted. She played the piano, and she loved to go to the theater. Now, they lived quite well in Skien, but the family was thrown into poverty when Ibsen was only 8 years of age because of problems his father was having with his business. So nearly all traces of their once affluent life had to be sold off in order to cover their household debts. And then the family moved to a kind of a rundown farm just outside of town. And there, Henrik spent much of his time reading and painting. At 15, Ibsen stopped attending school and went to work. And he landed a position as an apprentice at an apothecary in the nearby village of Grimstad. And he spent his limited free time there writing poetry. And it was there during those years that Ibsen wrote his very first play called Catalina, 1849. Now, Catalina is an historical drama. It's written in verse, and it's modeled after one of Ibsen's great influences, and that was, of course, William Shakespeare. Now, the main character is the noble Roman, Lucius Catalina, who is torn between 2 women, his wife, Aurelia, and the Vestal Virgin Fioria. Although Catalina may not be among Ibsen's best plays, it foreshadows many of the themes that we find in his later works. The lead character in particular is full of doubts and torn between love and duty, quite similar to the protagonist we see in both John Gabriel Borkman and The Master Builder. And the character of Fioria is considered by some to be the prototype for some of Ibsen's later female characters, such as Hedda Gabler. 1 year later, Henrik moved to Christiania to prepare for examinations and to study at the university. And there he made friends with other writers and artistic types. And it was one of those friends, Ole Skullerud, who in fact paid for the publication of Ibsen's first play that we just discussed. Yet even after the publication of Catalina, that play failed to get much attention at all. But the following year, Ibsen had a fateful encounter with famed violinist and theater manager Ole Bull. Now, Bull was immediately impressed by Ibsen's talent and his work ethic and offered him a job as a writer and manager at the Norwegian National Theater in Bergen. Ibsen, of course, jumped at the opportunity, and he did quite well in this position. But he soon wanted to return to the capital, Christiania, to run another theater, the Christiania Theater, where he premiered his second play, which he called Love's Comedy. And that was a satirical look at marriage in 1862. That same year, Ibsen decided to leave Norway to see what the other European countries had to offer, and he eventually settled in Rome. And there he wrote his third play, which was called Brand. It's a 5-act tragedy about a clergyman named Brand, whose feverish devotion to his faith cost him his family and ultimately his life. Now, Brand is a young idealist whose main purpose is to save the world, or at least to save people's souls, but yet his judgment of others is kind of harsh and certainly unfair. It's interesting to note that in Norwegian and Danish and Swedish and Dutch and German, the word brand essentially means fire. For the first time, both audience and critical attention was being paid to the writer, and Brand made Ibsen actually quite famous back home in Scandinavia. Now, 2 years later, and still in Rome, Ibsen created one of his masterworks, and that was Peer Gynt. Now, Peer Gynt is a modern take on some of the Greek epics of ancient times, and it follows the title character, Peer Gynt, on an adventurous quest, I guess you'd call it. And it tells the story of his downfall and his subsequent redemption. The 5-act play, with over 40 scenes, moves uninhibitedly in time and space, and between consciousness and the unconscious as well. The extremely cinematic script blends poetry with social satire, realistic scenes with surreal scenes. The piece explores a new kind of dramatic action that was actually far beyond the capabilities of theater of the day. Now, here you see 2 illustrations from the original publication of Peer Gynt. It's just to give you a sense of the look and feel and the style of the book. And just as an aside, as I briefly describe the plots of some of Ibsen's plays, please pay close attention to the unusual richness of his storylines. That was something truly unique to Henrik Ibsen's works. In 1868, Ibsen moved to Dresden, Germany, where he first saw his social drama, The Pillars of Society, performed in Munich, and the run was a great success. In the opening scene of Pillars of Society, we find a wealthy businessman. His name is Consul Bernick, at the height of his career. He's the richest, most powerful, respected citizen of the community. And he's held up as a model of an ideal husband and devoted father. In short, a worthy pillar of society. But as the story unfolds, however, we see some unscrupulous business dealings. We learn about how Consul Bernick jilted the love of his life for her stepsister because of a greater inheritance. We experience some scandalous shenanigans in a mistress's bedroom, and we discover a great lie involving stolen money, which was used to cover up the fact that Bernick's company, which was a massive shipyard, a shipbuilding yard, was actually insolvent. So in order to hide his acts, Bernick allows a ship to be launched which he knows is not seaworthy. And it's only after the ship has sailed does he discover that his own son, who has run away from home, is on board that ship. The Pillars of Society was soon followed by one of Henrik Ibsen's most famous works, and that is, of course, A Doll's House. When A Doll's House first premiered in 1879, the play was extremely controversial, not only in Scandinavia, but throughout Europe. And it was controversial because of Ibsen's exploration of the lead female character called Nora and her personal struggle balancing the traditional roles of wife and mother and her own need for self-exploration. Like in his previous works, In A Doll's House, Ibsen continued to question the accepted social practices in the time, taking his audiences off guard, which he always loved to do, and stirring up quite a debate. 2 years later, in 1881, came Ghosts, which was a scathing commentary on 19th century morality. Ghost stirred up even more controversy than his previous plays by taking on such topics as religion, incest and venereal disease, and euthanasia. So as you can imagine, Ghosts generated heated controversy and therefore received quite a bit of negative criticism. And the outcry was so powerful that the play was not performed widely until 2 years later. His next work, An Enemy of the People, focused on one man in conflict with his community. The setting is an unnamed town where their one and only resource is a hugely profitable health spa or springs, baths. And one day a workman accidentally discovered that the water at the baths is contaminated and their profitable world is soon shaken. So the mayor, the local doctor, and the editor of the newspaper all know that if the truth of the contamination gets out, they will all be ruined. So a decision has to be made. Do they hide the truth or just reshape the truth in order to get the results that they want? Ibsen's next play was The Lady from the Sea in 1888, and this continues to build on his powerful sense of drama. The Lady from the Sea is largely a symbolic play. It's centered around a lady called Elida, who's the daughter of a lighthouse keeper. Elida is married to Dr. Wangle, and they live somewhat frugally in a small coastal village. We soon learned, though, that some years earlier, Elida fell deeply in love with a sailor, and the two soon became engaged. But because it was discovered that the sailor had at one time murdered his ship's captain, he had to escape and leave the country. But before his departure, the sailor asked Elida for one commitment, and that was to wait for him. Years later, the sailor returns home to claim her, and she then has to choose between her first, perhaps her only true love, the sailor, or her current husband. Now, her husband, Dr. Wangle, finally realizes his wife's freedom to choose, and he understands that he really has no choice. She's going to make the decision. But this actually goes in his favor in the end, as she decides to choose him. After writing The Lady from the Sea, Ibsen headed back to Norway, where he would spend the remainder of his years. And there he wrote John Gabriel Borkman and The Wild Duck, with plots just as rich and intriguing, as colorful as the ones we've been discussing. But another one of his most famous works was still to come, and that play was Hedda Gabler. With Hedda Gabler, it's now 1890, Ibsen created one of the theater's most notorious characters. Hedda, a military general's daughter, is a newlywed who has already come to loathe her scholarly husband, but yet at the same time, she's willing to destroy a former lover who stands in the way of her husband's career academically. The title character in Hedda Gabler is considered one of the great dramatic roles in theater. It's interesting to note that Hedda's married name is actually Hedda Tesman. Gabler is her maiden name. And on the subject of why he chose this title, Ibsen wrote, "My intention in giving the play this name was to indicate that Hedda, as a personality, is to be regarded as her father's daughter rather than her husband's wife." Hedda Gabler has been canonized, as I'm sure you know, as a masterpiece within the genres of literary realism, 19th century theater, and world drama as a whole. By the time Ibsen had settled back in Norway, he was a literary hero. He he became, I should say, an internationally known playwright of solid proportions, although for much of his life, Ibsen had lived a somewhat reclusive existence. He seemed to thrive in the spotlight in his years later and became almost a tourist attraction of sorts in Norway's capital, Christiania. And it was after his return to Norway and after he turned 70 in 1889 that his work took on a more self-reflective quality, with more mature lead characters looking back and living with the consequences of their earlier life choices. And typically, as you can imagine from the other plots we've discussed, each of the dramas seemed to end on somewhat of a dark note. A perfect example would be The Master Builder. In the play, the lead character, whose name is Halvard Solness, encounters a young woman named Hilda, who encourages him to make good on a promise. Hilda reminds Solness that they're not, in fact, strangers, that they have previously met in her hometown 10 years earlier when she was only 13 years old. She reminds him that at one point during their encounter, he made advances towards her, had offered her a romantic interlude, and promised her what he called a kingdom. Although Solness denies this, Hilda gradually convinces him of their past history. And so perhaps out of guilt or simply to help her out, he's willing to take her home with him so she can assist with some household duties and earn some money. Now, Halvard Solness had a very complicated relationship with his wife, and we soon also learned that they had lost their children several years earlier as a result of a tragic fire. As time passes, though, Solness begins to develop a close tie with Hilda. What impresses him most about her is that she openly supports his architectural vocation, which his wife did not, and she encourages his new ideas. During the construction of his most recent project, which included a huge towering steeple, Hilda quietly discovers that Solness suffers from acrophobia, a morbid fear of extreme heights. Nonetheless, Hilda encourages him to climb to the very top of the steeple during the building's opening ceremony. So Solness, inspired by Hilda's excitement and her encouraging words, shakily makes it to the top of the tower. when he suddenly loses his footing and crashes to his death in front of the hundreds of spectators who have arrived for the opening. All the spectators stood aghast at the sight. Only Hilda comes forward slowly, as if in silent triumph, and she waves her shawl above her heads and cries with wild intensity, my master builder." A powerful statement of revenge, I think. And his very last play, When We Dead Awaken, 1899, Ibsen writes about an old sculptor who runs into one of his former models, in essence, to try to recapture his lost creative spark. Perhaps my favorite quote of Ibsen's about this title is, "When we dead awaken, we see that we have never lived." In 1900, Ibsen had a series of strokes that left him unable to write. He managed to live for several more years and died on May 23rd, 1906. It's interesting because before his death, though, Ibsen had a full-time nurse taking care of him at his home. And one day, a visitor arrived at the door, a friend of his, and he asked the nurse if he was feeling better. And the nurse replied, "Yes, he's feeling much better today." But suddenly, they both heard a deep voice from inside Ibsen's bedroom that yelled out, "Til det motsatte," meaning to the contrary. Ibsen received a full state funeral from the Norwegian government, and here are some photos of the funeral. Today, I think Henrik Ibsen's work continues to be performed all over the world and has a mainstay. It is a mainstay, I should say, in the classical theatrical repertoire. In fact, it's interesting to note that A Doll's House is the world's most performed play. Actresses such as Gillian Anderson and Kate Blanchett have taken on Ibsen's Nora and Hedda Gabler characters, which, as I mentioned, are considered to be two of the most demanding theatrical roles ever created. Ibsen's plays have been performed on Broadway and in London's West End over 100 times. And some of the more recent productions include An Enemy of the People, that you see there, directed by Doug Hughes at the Manhattan Theater Club, and a modern production of Peer Gynt, directed by John Doyle, and another, perhaps more contemporary, controversial version of Peer Gynt, and Public Enemy, a renamed version of An Enemy of the People at the Pearl Theater. And there was also, of course, a recent revival of The Master Builder, starring Ralph Fiennes. Ibsen's work is so popular that it has brought forward contemporary writers who have attempted to make some, I guess I'd call them a few minor adjustments to Ibsen's original scripts, perhaps in an attempt to create something new, such as, believe it or not, A Doll's Life, the musical, with books and lyrics by Betty Comden and Adolph Green and a score by Larry Grossman. This musical tells a speculative story of what happened to Nora, the lead character of the Ibsen play, after she left her husband and her old life behind to face the world on her own. Musical was actually directed by the great Hal Prince. Unfortunately, though, it closed just 3 days after it opened. I actually saw the piece, and it really wasn't very good. So that's that. That's theater. And then there was, of course, A Doll's House, Part 2, a similar concept, an imagined continuation of the original story. This show opened on Broadway in 2017, starring Laurie Metcalf, and was directed by Sam Gold. There have also been some twists on the original scripts. Here you see Peter Gynt, a rewrite of Peer Gynt, and it was written by David Hare. And you even see Peer Gynt and the Norwegian Hoppa Band, which I think I will miss. More recently, we saw Enemy of the People. They left off the "an." Enemy of the People, another reimagining of the original script, and this was done last summer here in New York at the Park Avenue Armory. And in Hollywood, there have been 21 feature films made from Henrik Ibsen's manuscripts, including 4 versions of Hedda Gabler and 3 of Peer Gynt. To all students of playwriting and theatrical drama, it has to be acknowledged that Henrik Ibsen was the true father of realism. What made him unique was that he didn't portray rich, powerful people or socially significant people, I should say, but rather he populated his drama with ordinary middle-class characters. He completely rewrote the rules of drama that, with that stark realism of his, which soon was adapted by so many other writers like Chekhov, and which we see very much in the theater today. His strong desire to challenge assumptions and his directly speaking about issues that mattered has been considered one of the factors that make a play art rather than just entertainment. And I believe his works have held up over the years because he tapped into universal themes and he explored the human condition in a way unlike any before him. He was known a great deal for his very pithy and funny quotes. You can see here a few. The worst enemy of truth and freedom in our society is the compact majority. And if you go to the bottom, look into any man's heart you please, and you will always find in everyone at least one black spot which he has to keep concealed. But I think my favorite of all of these is this one. It is inexcusable for scientists to torture animals. Let them make their experiments on journalists and politicians. I love that. Author James Joyce wrote that Ibsen has provoked more discussion and criticism than that of any other living man. Towards the end of his life, Ibsen wrote, "There is still much to be done in this country before we can be said to have achieved full freedom. But our present democracy scarcely has the power to accomplish that task. An element of nobility must enter into our political life, our government, our members of parliament, and our press." Regarding his family life, Ibsen had a long and happy marriage to Susanna de Thoresen. The couple wedded in 1858 and welcomed their only child, a son, Sigurd, the following year. Now, Sigurd Ibsen served as Prime Minister of Norway in Stockholm between 1903 and 1905 and played a central role in the dissolution of the union, the then union between Norway and Sweden. But let's take a moment here and jump back in time. Because while Henrik Ibsen was still living and working in Rome, I should say, he met a young musical artist, a fellow Norwegian, and their eventual collaboration would go down into history. The very first meeting between Henrik Ibsen and fellow Norwegian Edvard Grieg took place at the Scandinavian Society in Rome on Christmas Eve in 1865. Grieg was then a young adult of 22 years, and Ibsen was 15 years his senior. Ibsen must have quickly acquired a positive impression of Grieg, and he had seen, of course, the potential in his talent. And to a friend, Ibsen characterized Grieg as a splendid chap, one of those who will set the course of the future. Their communications were infrequent at first until 9 years later, when Ibsen sent a letter to Edvard Grieg on January 23rd, 1874, which changed their relationship forever. But before we get to that letter and discuss the content of that letter and its aftermath, let's talk a little bit about the young man, Edvard Grieg. He was born in Bergen on the 15th of June, 1843. His father, Alexander, was a merchant and vice consul in Bergen, and his mother, Gesine, was a music teacher. And she first taught Edvard to play the piano when he was 6 years old. In the summer of 1858, Grieg met the eminent Norwegian violinist Ole Bull, who was a family friend. And if you remember him, Ole Bull also met the young Henrik Ibsen and supported him in his career. Similarly, Bull recognized this 15-year-old's talent and persuaded his parents to send him to the Leipzig Conservatory to further study piano and music composition. No doubt the young Grieg enjoyed the many concerts and recitals and certainly the youthful nightlife that was offered in Leipzig, but he disliked the discipline of the conservatory. So he withdrew in the spring of 1860, just as he was surviving a life-threatening lung disease. In 1861, Grieg made his debut as a concert pianist in Karlshamn, Sweden. And the following year, he held his very first concert in his hometown of Bergen, where his program included playing Beethoven's popular Pathetique Sonata. In 1863, Grieg went to Copenhagen, where he stayed for 3 years. And there he met another fellow Norwegian by the name of Rikard Nordraak, who's actually the composer of the Norwegian national anthem. They became quick good friends and became a source of inspiration for each other. But unfortunately, Nordraak died just 3 years later of tuberculosis in 1866. Grieg, greatly saddened, of course, by that event, composed a funeral march in his honor. The next year, in 1867, Grieg married his first cousin, Nina Hagerup, a lyric soprano at his home in Bergen, which he called Trollhagen. Now, the home is beautifully situated on a promontory jutting out into Lake Nordas with a stunning view over the water. Now, the name Trollhagen comes from the Norwegian word trold, which of course means troll, and haug, or the Old Norse word hauger, meaning hill or knoll. It's said that the local children call the adjacent valley the Valley of the Trolls, and so Grieg thus took the name for his home as well. And he often referred to his home as my best composition hitherto. The following year, their only child, Alexandra, was born, but sadly, Alexandra passed away just 2 years later in 1869 from meningitis, and the couple remained childless for the rest of their lives. And now back to that letter that I mentioned, dated January 23rd, 1884. Dear Mr. Grieg, my object in writing to you is to ask if you would care to cooperate with me in a certain undertaking. I am thinking of adapting Peer Gynt for the stage. Will you compose the music that will be required? Let me indicate briefly how I think of arranging the play. And as you will see in the next section here, Ibsen was very clear and very specific with what he had in mind. He wanted, as you can see, the first act to be retained in full with only a few cuts, but Peer Gynt's monologue he wished to have treated as a melodrama. The wedding scene in scene 3 must be built up by means of a ballet into something more than is in the book. He wanted a specialty dance melody which would be used continually through the end of the act. In the second act, the musical treatment for the scene with the 3 cowherd girls must be left to the discretion of the composer, but there has to be a lot of deviltry in it. And of course, he needed a special theme for the Hall of the Mountain King. So these, as you can see, Ibsen went on and on and on, telling the composer exactly what needed to be done, how it should be done, and exactly what he expected of him. He was so specific, so precise with what he wanted in every scene, with every character. I'm surprised Grieg didn't just run, but he didn't, and thank God. Grieg spent more than 1 year composing the music for Peer Gynt. He started working on it in the summer of 1874, but struggled with the material at first and had some extremely mixed feelings throughout the course of the work process. In a letter to his friend Franz Bayer in August of 1874, he wrote, "With Peer Gynt, things are progressing very slowly, and finishing in the autumn is out of the question. It is a terribly intractable subject, except in some places such as where Solveig sings, which I have already completed." And he continued, "And then I have produced something for the Hall of the Mountain King, which I literally cannot stand to listen to. It rings so of cow dung, of Norwegianness, and to thyself be enoughness. But I also expect that the irony should be unmistakable, particularly when Peer, afterwards, against his will, is obliged to say both the dance and the music were utterly charming." Interesting. The musical score for Peer Gynt was completed while Grieg was at his summer house in Denmark in July 1875. But 1 month later, he had to return to Bergen, where his parents were laying on their deathbeds, and they both passed away that same autumn. But because of the lingering illness, then deaths, Grieg was subsequently prevented from taking part in the rehearsals of the play Peer Gynt, or I should say the musical Peer Gynt. And instead, in December 1875, he sent a letter of not less than 28 pages to the theater's orchestra conductor, Johan Hennem, essentially apologizing for the quality of his work. In the letter, Grieg writes, "The point is that there are many things in my score that have not been expressed as clearly as one might wish. and that I have recently discovered some places that could have been orchestrated better. The problem is that the music is, only in a few cases, purely music. It moves out onto the thin ice of caricature, which is really what he wanted to do, but he wasn't used to writing for a character, and characterizes the people often in such a crude manner that it becomes a matter of creating a precise effect so that the audience understands the intention. Indeed, I guess an artist, a perfectionist like Edvard Grieg is never really going to be happy with the final creation. The premiere of Peer Gynt took place on February 24th, 1876 at the Christiania Theater in Christiania. And note that this is the same theater that Henrik Ibsen ran during his early years in the capital. In his memoirs, theater director Ludvig Josephson described Peer Gynt as an unequivocal success. And reading Grieg's contribution, the newspaper Aftenposten wrote, Grieg's music was particularly effective and in a brilliant manner adapted to the situation. Actually, both Grieg and Ibsen were absent during rehearsal for the premiere performance, but apparently their absence had a little detrimental effect on the overall creation. Peer Gynt was performed 25 times that summer, 11 times the following season. By the standards of the day, that was a pretty successful run. And the production would have, without question, become a recurring piece in the theater's repertoire had it not been for a fatal fire at the Christiania Theater on January 15th, 1877, where the scenery, the costumes, the props for the production were completely destroyed. The connection between these two great artists, Ibsen and Grieg, are numerous and deep, but Peer Gynt, I think, has immortalized them both. And this work is actually sometimes referred to as their three-headed troll, because it could be performed as the orchestral suites, just the music, or it could be performed as the stage version with the music, or it could also be performed as the stage version without the music. Now, before I go any further, no one can really talk about the beautiful country called Norway and the culture of Norway without talking about trolls. Now, we all may know that a troll is a supernatural being in Norse mythology and Scandinavian folklore. Old Norse sources describe trolls as creatures dwelling in isolated rocks in mountains or caves. They live together in small family units and are rarely helpful to humans. But later in Scandinavian folklore, trolls became beings in their own right, where they live far from human habitation. They're not Christianized and are considered dangerous to human beings. Their appearance varies greatly. Trolls can be ugly, slow-witted, or they can look and behave exactly like human beings with no particularly grotesque characteristics about them. And so from Peer Gynt, let's listen now to Edvard Grieg's remarkable March of the Trolls. I've learned even a baby troll needs his sleep. An amazing piece for sure, because it perfectly conjures up the atmosphere and the mood and the intention of the scene, the March of the Trolls. And now let's listen to some more of Edvard Grieg's incredible music. In a particularly dramatic section of Peer Gynt, the title character finds himself in the hall of the Mountain King, where he's captured by trolls. He upsets the king of the trolls, which you don't want to do, when he refuses to marry the king's daughter and become a troll himself. So let's listen to Grieg's The Hall of the Mountain King. And it's accompanied by a few illustrations from various artists in various graphical styles and from various periods in order to visualize the scene. Let's have a listen. Again, amazing, dramatic, a powerful piece, The Hall of the Mountain King. And of course, we cannot forget the memorable wedding day at Trollhaugen. Initially, this was called Gratulanterne Komen, or The Well-Wishers Are Coming. Wedding Day at Trollhaugen was originally written just as a piano piece, and it was composed to commemorate, excuse me, the 25th of the silver anniversary of Edvard and Nina Grieg, which took place in 1896. Pay attention to the work's festive march-like first section, because I think it brings to mind all of the guests arriving, the congratulations, the best wishes that are given to either a newlywed or a couple celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary. And while we listen, we'll look at some old photos taken over the years at Trollhaugen. Let's take a listen. Okay, here I think are two wonderful photographs of Edvard Grieg and Nina in their beautiful home. If you have never been to Trollhaugen, please be sure to take the tour. It's a remarkable place. You must visit this historic and very, very special place. In his later years, the Norwegian government provided Edvard Grieg with a pension from which he lived comfortably for the rest of his life. But he died from heart failure in Bergen, Norway on September 4th, 1907, after suffering a long period of illness. He was 64 years old. And his final words were, "Well, if it must be so." His funeral drew over 40,000 people out onto the streets of Bergen to honor him. And following his wish, his own funeral march that he wrote in memory of his friend Rikard Nordrak was played in a lavish orchestration by Grieg's friend Johan Halvorsen. Grieg was cremated, and his ashes are entombed in a mountain crypt just below his home. The ashes of his wife Nina were placed alongside his after she passed away in December of 1935. So let's listen to a little bit of that funeral march. This was actually Grieg's first composition. I'd like to close today with perhaps the most famous part of the Ibsen-Grieg collaboration of Peer Gynt. It's Edvard Grieg's internationally famous Ode to Morning. Ode to Morning is the first of four movements that make up the Peer Gynt Suite #1 and was written to depict in the story the sun rising above the Moroccan desert during Act 4, Scene 4 of the Ibsen play. So let's listen to Grieg's powerful Ode to Morning. And so, ladies and gentlemen, inspired by that great, beautiful landscape of Norway, we have Edvard Grieg and Henrik Ibsen forever in our minds, and we thank them, or I thank them especially, for blessing us with what I call the words and music of Norway. Thank you so much, and always safe travels. Thank you.